Hey everyone, for today's video, I'll be ranking Luffy's fights. These are my thoughts and they could change, so I respect your guys' opinions. And I'm basing these on the fight's emotional impact and story relevance. So let's get started. So first is at D tier. D tier is the lowest, while S tier is the highest. So Luffy's fight with Foxy, the Silver Fox, is one of the silliest and funniest battles in One Piece. Instead of being super serious, it's all about goofy pirate games. Foxy has a silly power called the Noro Noro Beam that just slows people down instead of hurting them. Luffy wears funny costumes, like an afro wig, and uses silly tricks like mirrors to try and win. Even though it's fun to watch, the fight doesn't really help Luffy grow or teach him any big lessons. Foxy is more of a silly prankster than a real bad guy, and he doesn't cause any big trouble for the Straw Hats. After the exciting Skypiea story, this arc feels more like a break than a big adventure. The battle doesn't change anything in the long run, and many fans don't think it's very important. And some parts feel slow, and not everyone likes that. But it can still be fun if you enjoy silly moments and, jokes. So next at D tier still is Alvida and Buggy. I'll just put these two together. So although their fights weren't particularly difficult, Luffy's first significant adversaries, Alvida and Buggy, contributed to the beginning of the One Piece adventure. One punch was enough to defeat Alvida, which demonstrates the potency of Luffy's new abilities. It was merely an enjoyable way to watch Luffy in action. There was no significant plot or emotion. Because Buggy could disassemble his body like a puzzle, it was a little more enjoyable though than the Alvida fight. Although the fight was ridiculous due to his ridiculous abilities, it was more humorous than serious. And that's where he dropped the Shanks thing, In fact, Nami and her cunning scheme were the most fascinating parts. Although Buggy returns later in the narrative and assumes a more significant role, he was more of a humorous clown than a genuine threat during this battle. In contrast to the large, active villains Luffy typically battles, Captain Kuro is portrayed as a cunning and intelligent enemy. He uses his Shakushi attack, which looks cool but is a messy and difficult to follow, and he has sharp claws as well. It was a little exciting because he had a cunning plan to defraud Kaya and steal her money, but when Luffy does fight him, he quickly prevails with a single powerful headbutt. The fight doesn't seem particularly emotional, and Kuro presents himself as composed and serious, and he is tired of being a pirate. This could have been more intriguing in contrast to Luffy's carefree demeanor, but they don't do much. Kuro's crew isn't particularly cool or scary, they are mostly goofy and forgettable. The fight itself isn't the best part of the arc. Usopp, who develops and becomes braver, is. Because Kuro doesn't feel like a big intimidating boss, the plot moves slowly and isn't particularly exciting. The fight isn't particularly enjoyable or memorable, despite the fact that it depicts the type of pirate Luffy aspires to be. It's a prelude to the truly amazing battles that will come later. As an early fight that doesn't really stand out, it ultimately belongs in the D tier. And the last spot that belongs in the D tier is Don Krieg. So although it has some interesting moments, Luffy's fight with Don Krieg at the Baratier, a floating restaurant, isn't one of the best. Don Krieg primarily uses tricks and tries to appear tough, but his large golden armor, his massive ship, and numerous hidden weapons make him look really scary. Luffy refuses to give in and continues to fight with all of his heart and strength. Although there is some excitement because Sanji's dream and the restaurant are in jeopardy, Krieg doesn't have a particularly strong bond with the crew. All he is a cruel bully who desires to rule. The moves are thus entertaining to watch in other battles, and there are slow moments in the fight. One awesome moment is when Luffy breaks through Krieg's armor and continues to move forward even when things get really difficult, such as when he's submerged. Ultimately, however, neither Luffy nor Krieg gain any knowledge. It's a passable battle that advances a plot, but it does not have any significant effect. So now let's move on to C tier. First in C tier is we have Hody Jones. Hody Jones had the chance to be a really important villain because he was tied to the main theme of racism and hate in Fishman Island, but he ended up falling flat. His entire belief system is built on hate with no real logic behind it, which makes him the opposite of peaceful figures like Queen Otohime and Fisher Tiger. That contrast could have been powerful, but Hody comes off as a one-dimensional and more like someone delivering a message than a fully developed character. The fight itself though, it looked awesome. Luffy shows off his new powers from the time skip. It's his first major fight since the time skip, and he fights underwater and even stops Noah's ship from crashing into the island. But even with all the build-up, Hody gets overwhelmed way too easily. Even after taking the drugs to make himself stronger, he never really felt like a serious fight or a threat to Luffy. The real emotion in the arc comes from the island's history and characters like Shirahoshi, not from the fight itself. While the action is solid, the long pacing of the arc hurts the impact of the final showdown. Luffy doesn't really grow or learn anything in this fight, he just simply wins. That's why this fight lands in C tier. It's more about the message than the battle. Wapol. In terms of personal rivalry and physical threat, Wapol is undoubtedly one of Luffy's weakest enemies. He is cartoonishly cruel, conceited, and cowardly, which makes it difficult to take him seriously. His primary function in the story is to represent oppression and corruption, standing in stark contrast to Dr. Hiluluk and Kureha's generosity. The backstory of Chopper, not the actual battle, is what gives this arc emotional weight. Although Wapol's Baku Baku no Mi lets him eat and mix things, it's not used to create a dynamic battle but rather in ridiculous ways. There is no tension or creative strategy in Luffy's quick and decisive victory over him. The best part is when Luffy demonstrates his profound regard for his future crewmate by refusing to allow Wapol to make fun of Chopper's dream. The actual battle, however, is short, unbalanced, and more humorous than violent. Wapol is less of a real enemy and more of a narrative stepping stone. Although he aligns with the emotional themes of the arc, the fight itself only receives a C tier rating. So the last person in C tier is Caesar Clown. Caesar Clown is one of One Piece's more unusual enemies, relying more on science and chemical warfare than on physical force. He is smart, cruel, and exemplifies the negative aspects of technological progress by testing human weapons and performing experiments on children. Caesar himself never poses a physical threat to Luffy, even though the arc introduces significant world-building elements such as the smiles and the sads. He's easily defeated by Luffy on numerous occasions. His cleverness and the chaotic atmosphere of Punk Hazard are the only reasons he is a bother. Apart from Luffy's Gear Second, the fight isn't very imaginative or cinematic. Luffy and Caesar have no emotional attachment to one another, and their goal is to prevent an atrocity rather than exact revenge or defend a loved one. Despite the lackluster fight, Caesar is important to the plot because the arc introduces Dressrosa, Doflamingo, and Kaido. Caesar is not so much a boss villain as he is a plot device and comic relief. The climax feels unsatisfactory because Luffy easily defeats him with a punch. Despite Caesar's long-term relevance, the place his fight firmly in the C tier. So let's start at B tier, and B tier has a bunch of guys, and firstly, he's Bluno. Bluno was never meant to be one of Luffy's biggest enemies, but their fight became iconic because it was the debut of Gear Second. When Luffy powered up and started steaming, the jump in strength and speed was huge. It immediately raised the hype and changed how we saw his abilities. The fight looked amazing, with smooth and intense action, and Bluno, as a member of CP9, was the perfect opponent to show off Luffy's new form. At first, Bluno's Dordor fruit made for some creative moves, but once Gear Second kicked in, he didn't stand a chance. Even though the fight didn't have much emotional weight, the tension was real because it marked the beginning of the mission to save Robin. It also helped build up to the much bigger and more emotional fight with Rob Lucci. Bluno wasn't a super deep as a character, and the fight was really short, but it had great pacing and impact. More importantly, it showed how much Luffy had grown since Water 7, both in power and in mindset. That's why this battle is a solid B tier. It's short, it's stylish, and it's a perfect lead-up to what came next. So next is we have Bellamy. Luffy's fights with Bellamy aren't really about flashy action. They're more about what Luffy stands for. In Jaya, after being mocked for believing in dreams and Sky Island, Luffy doesn't even fight back. He just lands one powerful punch and knocks Bellamy out, showing how strong his beliefs are and how mature he's become. In Dressrosa, Bellamy is a different person. He's still loyal to Doflamingo, even though he's been used and tossed aside. Luffy tries to talk to him because he respects Bellamy and doesn't want to hurt him, but Bellamy insists on fighting. The actual battle is short and messy, but it's packed with emotion and conflict. These fights aren't about who's stronger, they're about pride. Luffy shows that sometimes real strength means not fighting, and we see how much both he and Bellamy have grown. The deeper meaning puts these fights in the B tier even without a huge battle scene. So up next in B tier is Usopp. Luffy's fight with Usopp is one of the most emotional moments in the whole series. It's not about flashy powers or huge attacks. It's powerful because it's a fight between two close friends. Their argument feels raw and real. Luffy thinks they need to move forward, while Usopp feels left behind and refuses to let go of the going merry. Even though Usopp is way weaker, he gives it everything he's got, using clever tricks, traps, and every tool he can. Luffy takes it seriously the whole time as well, showing both respect and deep sadness. When Luffy wins, there's no cheering, just silence and heartbreak. This fight isn't about victory, it's about their friendship, pride, and the painful reality of growing apart. It sets the emotional tone for the Water 7 and Enies Lobby arcs. Even without any big explosions or power-ups, the meaning behind the fight puts it solidly in B tier, maybe even A tier, depending on how much it hit you. Enel. Luffy's fight with Enel stands out because, even though Enel sees himself as a god and has powerful lighting abilities, Luffy's rubber body makes him totally immune. This removes a lot of the danger from the fight, but it also leads to some funny and unexpected moments. The real emotional core of the arc isn't Luffy, it's the Shandians, the people of Skypiea, and the mystery of the Lost City. Enel is definitely a memorable villain with a serious god complex, but since Luffy isn't deeply connected to the arc's deeper conflicts, it weakens the impact of the fight. Themes like man versus god and freedom versus control show up throughout, and Luffy's final punch using the giant golden ball is both symbolic and satisfying. However, even with its grand setting, the fight suffers from uneven pacing and a lack of strong personal stakes for Luffy. That's why it doesn't go higher than B tier. Still, Enel's shocked face when he realizes Luffy is immune, it was legendary. Next is Lucci's rematch with Luffy. Luffy's rematch with Lucci is like a fun twist on their old Enies Lobby fight, showing just how much stronger and more confident Luffy has become. Even though Lucci's leveled up and awakened his devil fruit, Luffy's Gear 5 is clearly on another level. The fight is short, flashy, and sometimes goofy, with Luffy messing around in his cartoonish Nika form while Lucci stays all serious, which makes for a funny contrast. This time, there's no deep meaning or emotional drama. It's more of a quick clash than a real showdown. The fight mainly exists to show off how strong Luffy is after Wano, but it doesn't push the story or his character forward. While it's definitely fun to watch and bring back some nostalgia, the outcome is never really in doubt. Because it lacks high stakes and emotional depth, it lands solidly in the mid-B tier. Then the last character for the B tier is Gecko Moria. Luffy's fight with Moria was different from his other battles because of its creepy setting and big scale, but it also felt a bit all over the place. Since Moria isn't very strong on his own, he mostly relies on his army of zombies and his shadow powers, which made the fight more confusing than exciting at times. When Luffy turned into Nightmare Luffy by absorbing 100 shadows, it looked cool but it didn't feel as epic as it could have been. For me, the most emotional moment actually happens after the fight, when Zoro takes all of Luffy's pain and just says, "Nothing happened." Moria, compared to the other powerful enemies, isn't that scary and is often used more for creepy jokes than as a real threat. The fight also dragged on with lots of stops and starts. Still, it had some creative parts, a dark and spooky vibe, and helped set things up for the Straw Hats' next big journey into the new world. So now we move on to the A tier. The first person in A tier is Crocodile. Crocodile was really Luffy's first big challenge. Not only was he one of the most powerful warlords of the sea, but he actually beat Luffy twice without holding back. And as a kid watching that, it was shocking. Luffy had to fight harder than ever, both in his body and his mind. He even came up with smart ways to fight, like using water and even his own blood to stop Crocodile's sand powers. The fight felt even more serious because Vivi's country was falling apart and people's lives were on the line. When Luffy punched Crocodile into the sky, it felt like he was standing up for justice and giving hope to everyone. The story also showed how war, government, and the rebellion can affect people. Still, the final fight was a little messy because the pacing dragged and it repeated some scenes. Even with that, it's definitely an A-tier fight. Next is Kizaru. Luffy's fight with Kizaru is a huge deal. It's his first real fight with an admiral since becoming a Yonko, and the stakes are sky high. Unlike his fight with Lucci, Kizaru is an actual threat, able to hit hard and keep up with the speed of Gear 5. The clash isn't just about power, it's also about ideals. Luffy fights for freedom, while Kizaru follows orders even though he clearly doesn't like the role he's playing, as we all know what he said to Akainu after the Egghead arc. Their abilities make the fight super cool to watch, with Kizaru's light powers clashing against Luffy's cartoon-like Gear 5th in flashy, high-speed battles. Kizaru's quiet inner conflict adds a layer of emotion, making the whole thing feel a bit tragic. Both of them take serious damage, showing how close the match really is, even if it ends without a clear winner. There's no personal hatred between them, but it still feels like a legendary moment, symbolizing the fight between control and freedom. Right now, it stands as a solid low A-tier fight, and it could go even higher depending on how the rest of the arc wraps up. So next in A-tier is Doflamingo. The stake and scope of Luffy versus Doflamingo was enormous, a warlord of the sea using fraud, puppetry, and terror to rule an entire country, particularly after controlling King Riku and enslaving Dressrosa. Doflamingo's distorted authority over people's lives made him incredibly despised. With his exaggerated mobility and raw power, Gear 4 marked the dramatic new evolution in Luffy's fighting style. Although Law, Rebecca, and Kyros were more at the center of the emotional core than Luffy himself, the weight of the country's suffering raised the stakes. The battle's closing moments were fierce and well-earned, despite being drawn out and compromised by side stories. More than any other villain since Crocodile, Doflamingo was one of Luffy's most persistent and cunning enemies. Luffy's victory seemed powerful when the images of Dressrosa collapsing and the people screaming for aid were shown. Despite lacking a strong personal bond, this fight was impressive in terms of spectacle and symbolism, earning it a spot in A-tier. Arlong. Luffy's fight with Arlong was the first truly emotional battle in One Piece, and it carried the pain of Nami's tragic past and years of being treated like a slave. One of the most powerful moments in the whole series is when Luffy destroys Arlong Park, especially the room where Nami is forced to draw maps for years. This fight wasn't just about strength. It was Luffy standing up against cruelty and proving what kind of captain he really is. Arlong was a strong enemy who believed fishmen were better than humans, and that twisted mindset made him dangerous. Nami's emotional breakdown and Luffy placing his hat on her head are still some of the most touching moments in the series. Luffy took a lot of damage, but he kept going to protect what mattered most. Even though the fight wasn't as huge in scale as later ones, the personal stakes made it unforgettable. That's why this battle is easily A-tier. It's the first time a One Piece fight felt like a masterpiece. So now we move on to the S-tier fights. The first fight in S-tier is Rob Lucci. Luffy versus Rob Lucci is probably the most intense and emotional fight in the entire Enies Lobby arc, and maybe even the whole series. What makes it so powerful is that Luffy isn't just fighting to win, he's fighting to save Robin after she finally admits that she wants to live. This battle pushes Luffy to his limits, using both Gear 2 and Gear 3 in a brutal, evenly matched showdown. Lucci, with his cold attitude and loyalty to the world government, feels like the perfect villain to represent everything Luffy is fighting against. The setting, a crumbling government base surrounded by fire and ocean, makes the situation feel even more desperate. One of the most unforgettable moments is when Luffy falls from exhaustion, but gets back up after hearing Usopp call out to him. The final jet Gatling attack is powerful, emotional, and incredibly satisfying to watch. This fight has it all: the insane action, deep emotional stakes, and huge character growth. That's why it easily ranks at the top. It's the perfect mix of heart and hype. The next fight is Katakuri. Luffy versus Katakuri isn't just a crazy fight, it's a battle about values, respect, and personal growth. At first, Katakuri seems unbeatable with his advanced observation haki, but Luffy slowly adapts and grows during the fight to match him. The fight is very long, but the pacing is spot on, filled with amazing action, emotional moments, and even quiet scenes that let everything sink in. Over time, Katakuri goes from being a serious enforcer of Big Mom's rules to someone who truly respects Luffy as an equal. For Luffy, the fight isn't just about winning, it's about proving he's worthy of being a captain in the new world. The mirror world setting makes it feel like a symbolic reflection of both their struggles. By the end though, both of them collapse from exhaustion, and the respect between them is clear. Even without words, this fight is deep, character-driven, and it belongs in the S tier. And finally, the last fight is against Kaido. Luffy vs Kaido is hands down the most epic and legendary fight in One Piece so far. At first, Kaido is a total beast. He crushes Luffy multiple times, forcing him to grow stronger not just in body but in mind and spirit too. Everything changes when Luffy unlocks Gear 5, turning the battle into something completely new and wild, with cartoon-like freedom and energy. Luffy, full of joy and determination, goes up against Kaido, who represents brutal control and hopelessness. Their fight is packed with insane animation, rooftop brawls, lightning attacks, and giant dragon transformations. It's really visually on another level. The frame rate is insane. One of the most powerful moments is when Luffy comes back from near death smiling, as the people of Wano cheer for their freedom. Kaido's fall doesn't just free Wano, it shakes the whole world. This fight is the peak of Luffy's journey to becoming a true symbol of freedom, which easily makes it an S tier.